If a man has a title, people applaud before he speaks. If he has character, they usually notice too late. The ballroom overlooking Manhattan glittered beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most homes. Politicians, investors, celebrities, and royalty from several countries moved through the crowd carrying glasses of sparkling water and exchanging polished smiles. Every conversation seemed to circle back to one question. Who would Charlotte Sterling finally choose? Richard Sterling stood near the grand staircase with the confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades building one of the largest technology empires in America. Forbes called him a billionaire visionary. Financial magazines called him a kingmaker. Tonight, however, he was simply a father waiting for his daughter to arrive. "I heard it is a European prince," one guest whispered. "No, it is a technology CEO," another replied. Richard smiled politely, but said nothing. Truthfully, he did not know. Charlotte had refused to reveal the name. Yet he felt certain of one thing. Whoever walked through those doors would belong to the same world as everyone else in the room. Wealth recognized wealth. Status recognized status. That was how life worked. At least that was what Richard believed. A string quartet played softly from a raised platform, while cameras from Society magazines documented every important face in attendance. The atmosphere carried the excitement of a royal announcement. Across the ballroom, enormous windows revealed the glowing skyline beyond the river. Everything about the evening reflected prestige. Then the music seemed to fade. Several guests near the entrance suddenly stopped talking. Heads began turning toward the main doors. Richard noticed the shift immediately. A moment later, the doors opened. Charlotte stepped inside wearing an elegant white gown that drew attention throughout the room. Her chestnut brown hair rested neatly across her shoulders. She looked confident, graceful, and completely unbothered by the hundreds of eyes following her. But she was not alone. Walking beside her was a man nobody recognized. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with quiet confidence. His dark brown hair was neatly trimmed. His charcoal jacket fit well, though it clearly belonged to a world far removed from luxury fashion houses and private royal tailors. More surprising than anything else was the fact that he looked entirely comfortable. Not impressed, not intimidated, simply present. Murmurs spread across the ballroom. "Who is that?" someone asked. Another guest checked a phone, searching for a name that did not appear in any social registry. Richard felt his smile weaken slightly. Charlotte approached him with calm determination. The mysterious man remained beside her. The crowd waited. The cameras focused. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then Charlotte looked directly at her father and said the words nobody expected to hear. "Dad, I would like you to meet Mason Brooks." Silence settled over the ballroom. Not because everyone knew who Mason was. The silence came from realizing that nobody did. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The silence hanging over the ballroom felt heavier than the music that had filled it moments earlier. Richard Sterling studied the man standing beside his daughter. Mason Brooks offered a polite handshake. "It is a pleasure to meet you, sir," he said calmly. Richard accepted the handshake, though his mind was already racing through questions. Around them, conversations remained frozen. Guests who had expected royalty or corporate legends now stared openly at a man they had never seen before. Charlotte seemed completely aware of the tension and completely unconcerned by it. "Dad, Mason and I have been together for almost a year," she said. The announcement created another wave of surprise throughout the room. Richard blinked. Almost a year. Somehow his daughter had managed to keep an entire relationship hidden from one of the most connected families in America. "A year?" he asked quietly. Charlotte nodded. "I wanted people to know him before they judged him." Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. They knew exactly what she meant. Richard forced a smile. Years of business negotiations had taught him how to remain composed under pressure. "Well," he said, "why do we not sit down and talk?" Charlotte agreed immediately. Mason simply nodded. A private table near the ballroom windows was prepared for the three of them. Beyond the glass, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Inside, curiosity followed them across the room like a spotlight. Once seated, Richard folded his hands. "So, Mason, tell me about yourself." Mason leaned back comfortably. "There is not much to tell." Richard almost laughed. Every successful person he had ever met enjoyed talking about accomplishments. Mason seemed different. "What do you do for a living?" Richard asked. "I own a woodworking shop in Connecticut." Richard paused. A woodworking shop. Yes, sir. Mason smiled. Custom furniture, restoration projects, handcrafted pieces. Mostly local work. Richard glanced briefly at Charlotte. He was certain she understood what everyone in the room was thinking. And you enjoy that? Richard asked. Very much. Mason answered without hesitation. I get to build things that last. The answer was simple. Genuine. Yet it somehow made Richard feel even more confused. And before that? Richard asked. Before what? Before the woodworking business. Mason's expression softened. I was raising my daughter. Richard looked up. You have a daughter? Her name is Olivia. She is 9 years old. For the first time, Charlotte smiled more brightly than she had all evening. She is wonderful, she said. Mason's eyes immediately warmed at the mention of her name. It was a small change, but Richard noticed it. The reaction was instinctive, impossible to fake. You are a single father? Richard asked. Yes, sir. Around them, guests continued pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Richard looked across the ballroom filled with hedge fund managers, celebrities, executives, and political leaders. Then he looked back at Mason. Nothing about this conversation matched the future he had imagined for his daughter. Yet the man sitting before him showed no insecurity, no desire to impress, and no sign of embarrassment. He simply answered honestly. And somehow, that honesty made Richard far more uncomfortable than any title ever could. Long after the conversation ended, Richard Sterling continued thinking about Mason Brooks. The ballroom eventually returned to its usual rhythm of polite conversations and expensive smiles, but something had changed. Throughout the evening, Richard found himself watching the man from a distance. Mason did not move through the crowd the way ambitious people usually did. He was not collecting business cards. He was not searching for influential introductions. He was not trying to impress anyone. Instead, he spent most of his time listening. When someone spoke, Mason paid attention. When a waiter accidentally dropped a serving tray nearby, Mason was the first person to help gather the scattered items. When an elderly guest struggled with a chair, Mason quietly assisted without drawing attention to himself. Small moments. Simple moments. Yet Richard noticed every one of them. Near the end of the evening, Charlotte stepped onto a balcony overlooking the river. The cool night air offered relief from the crowded ballroom. A few minutes later, Mason joined her. Through the glass doors, Richard could see them talking. He remained inside, unseen, watching from a distance. Charlotte laughed at something Mason said. The sound carried faintly through the doorway. It was not the polite laugh she used at charity galas or corporate dinners. It was genuine. Richard had not heard that laugh in years. As he observed them, memories unexpectedly surfaced. He remembered Charlotte as a little girl running through the backyard with grass stains on her shoes. He remembered the years before private schools, before business magazines, before security teams and luxury penthouses. Back when happiness seemed simpler. Richard slowly looked away. For the first time that evening, uncertainty entered his thoughts. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the ballroom stood nearly empty, Richard sat alone in his private office overlooking the city. The lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the windows. On his desk rested a tablet containing information his staff had gathered within only a few hours. A photograph of Mason appeared on the screen. Richard began reading. Woodworking business owner. Resident of Connecticut. Single father. Community volunteer. No scandals. No lawsuits. No hidden financial disasters. The report contained almost nothing remarkable. Yet that absence bothered Richard more than any shocking discovery could have. Successful people usually left trails. Acquisitions. Investments. Public achievements. Mason seemed to have spent the last decade building a life rather than a reputation. Richard continued reading. There were references to local school projects. Donations made anonymously. Mentorship programs. Community workshops teaching young people practical skills. None of it generated publicity. None of it generated profit. Richard leaned back in his chair. Why? He murmured to himself. The question lingered unanswered in the quiet office. Meanwhile, several miles away, Mason drove Charlotte home through the glowing city streets. The traffic moved slowly beneath towers of glass and light. Charlotte looked toward him. My father is investigating you. Mason smiled. I assumed he would. Does that bother you? She asked. Mason shook his head. No. Charlotte studied him for a moment. Most people would be nervous. Mason glanced ahead at the road. I am not most people. Charlotte smiled softly. Neither of them noticed that, across the city, Richard Sterling was still staring at a photograph of the man he could not understand. And the more he learned about Mason Brooks, the less certain he became that wealth was the best way to measure a man's worth. The following Saturday morning, Mason Brooks parked his truck outside the Sterling family estate and sat quietly behind the wheel for a moment. The property stretched across rolling green hills outside the city, surrounded by iron gates, stone walls, and perfectly maintained gardens. It looked less like a home and more like something preserved from another century. Charlotte had warned him that her father wanted to spend the afternoon together. She had not called it a test. She did not need to. Mason stepped out of the truck wearing a clean navy shirt and dark jeans. He carried himself exactly as he always did. No performance, no strategy, no attempt to become someone else. A member of the household staff escorted him through the enormous residence. Marble floors reflected sunlight pouring through towering windows. Paintings worth millions lined the hallways. Everything communicated power, success, and status. Yet Mason found himself thinking about Olivia's soccer game scheduled for the next morning. Some priorities never changed. Richard Sterling was waiting in a private library filled with shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. The billionaire stood beside a large window overlooking the estate grounds. "Thank you for coming," Richard said. "Thank you for inviting me," Mason replied. Richard motioned toward a chair. "Please sit." They settled across from each other. For a few moments, neither man spoke. The silence felt intentional. Richard finally broke it. "Tell me something honestly." Mason nodded. "All right." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Why Charlotte?" Mason looked surprised by the question. "Because I love her." Richard almost smiled. Most people would have given a much longer answer. "It is still the truth." Richard studied him carefully. "You understand that she could have chosen almost anyone." Mason nodded. "Yes. Business leaders, politicians, athletes, royal families. Probably." Richard folded his hands. "And yet she chose you." Mason smiled faintly. "You should ask Charlotte why." Richard shook his head. "I already know her answer." The billionaire stood and walked toward the window. "I am trying to understand yours." Mason remained quiet. Outside, sunlight moved across the gardens while a fountain sparkled in the distance. Finally, Mason spoke. "When I met Charlotte, I did not know who she was." Richard turned. "You did not?" "No, sir." Richard seemed genuinely surprised. "Not everyone follows business magazines." Mason smiled. Richard laughed softly despite himself. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Richard asked about business, family, responsibility, failure, success. Mason answered every question honestly. Sometimes the answers were simple. Sometimes they were uncomfortable. Yet they never changed. He never exaggerated. He never attempted to impress. Late in the afternoon, a house employee entered carrying refreshments. As she placed a tray on the table, one glass tipped and spilled water across several documents. The employee immediately looked horrified. "I am so sorry." Before anyone else reacted, Mason stood and helped gather the papers. "It is all right," he said gently. "Accidents happen." The employee looked relieved. Richard watched silently. It was a small moment. Most people would forget it within minutes. Yet somehow it stayed with him. Because throughout the entire day, Mason Brooks treated everyone exactly the same. Whether billionaire or employee, every person received the same respect. And for the first time, Richard began wondering if that quality might be rarer than wealth itself. The drive back to Connecticut gave Richard Sterling far more to think about than he expected. For years, he had measured people through accomplishments, influence, and financial success. That system had helped him build an empire. Yet Mason Brooks seemed to operate according to an entirely different set of rules. The thought followed Richard throughout the following week. Meanwhile, life continued as normal for Mason. Every morning began before sunrise. He prepared breakfast for Olivia, packed her school lunch, and drove her to school before opening the woodworking shop. The building sat along a quiet street lined with small businesses and family-owned stores. The scent of fresh-cut oak and maple filled the air. Customers arrived throughout the day seeking handcrafted furniture, repairs, and custom projects. Mason greeted each person with the same calm respect. One Thursday afternoon, Richard arrived unexpectedly. A black sedan pulled into the parking lot, drawing curious looks from nearby shop owners. Mason looked up from a workbench as the billionaire stepped inside. "Mr. Sterling," Mason said. "Good afternoon." Richard glanced around the workshop. Sunlight streamed through high windows. Tools hung neatly on the walls. Half-finished furniture stood beside completed pieces awaiting delivery. Nothing about the space looked extravagant, yet everything reflected care. "I was in the area," Richard said. Mason smiled politely. "Connecticut is a long way from Manhattan." Richard almost laughed. "You noticed details. Occupational habit." For the next hour, Richard observed rather than questioned. Customers entered and left. An elderly woman arrived carrying a damaged rocking chair. Mason stopped what he was doing and helped carry it inside. A young couple came to discuss a dining table they hoped to buy after saving money for months. Mason patiently adjusted the design to fit their budget. No cameras were present. No reporters. No executives. Nobody important by society's standards. Yet Mason treated every customer as though they mattered. Later that afternoon, school ended. Olivia rushed through the workshop door carrying a backpack nearly half her size. "Dad," she called. Mason immediately set aside a measuring tool and smiled. "How was your science test?" Olivia grinned. 98%. Mason placed a hand over his heart. "That is better than I ever did." Olivia laughed. Then she noticed Richard. "Oh." Mason made introductions. Olivia offered a polite handshake. Richard accepted it. "Your father talks about you often," he said. Olivia smiled proudly. "I talk about him too." The answer seemed simple, yet it stayed with Richard. As the afternoon continued, he watched father and daughter work together. Olivia swept sawdust from the floor. Mason explained measurements for a cabinet project. They joked, laughed, and moved through the workshop like a team that genuinely enjoyed being together. There was no performance, no attempt to impress anyone, only family. As evening approached, Richard prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, he paused and looked back. Mason was helping Olivia with homework at a small desk near the office window. The setting sun cast warm golden light across the workshop. For reasons Richard could not fully explain, that image affected him more than every luxury penthouse, private jet, and corporate boardroom he had ever seen. Because for the first time, he began wondering whether the richest man in the room had never been himself at all. The image of Mason and Olivia stayed with Richard Sterling long after he returned to Manhattan. Days passed, yet he found himself thinking less about balance sheets and acquisitions and more about a woodworking shop filled with sawdust and laughter. It was unfamiliar territory. Richard had spent most of his life pursuing growth, opportunity, and influence. Sacrifice had always been part of the journey, but somewhere along the way he had begun assuming that every successful person followed the same path. Then Mason Brooks appeared and quietly challenged everything he believed. One evening, Richard sat alone in his office reviewing another background report prepared by his staff. This one contained information that had never reached the earlier summaries. He began reading. 15 years earlier, Mason had been offered a senior design position with a major manufacturing company. The salary would have changed his life. The promotion included relocation, stock options, and a leadership track that could have led to executive management. Richard continued reading. Mason declined the offer. A second opportunity appeared 2 years later. Another promotion. Another significant increase in income. Another chance to climb higher. Again, he refused. Richard frowned. Few people willingly walked away from opportunities like those. Then he reached the explanation. Olivia had been young. Her mother had passed away unexpectedly. Mason had chosen stability over ambition because he did not want his daughter growing up surrounded by strangers while he chased success across the country. Richard slowly lowered the report. Outside his office window, thousands of lights illuminated the city skyline. Yet for several moments, he simply stared at the page. The decision made no financial sense. It made no strategic sense. And somehow that was exactly what affected him. The following weekend, Charlotte visited her father for lunch. They sat on a terrace overlooking the gardens while a fountain quietly flowed nearby. Richard listened as Charlotte described a recent community event where Mason had volunteered his entire Saturday helping restore a local youth center. "He never told me about that," Richard said. Charlotte smiled. "He rarely tells anyone." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Does he always put other people first?" Charlotte looked toward the gardens before answering. "Not always." Richard raised an eyebrow. "No." Charlotte smiled softly. "He puts Olivia first." The answer settled between them. Richard remembered the photograph from the report. He remembered the workshop. He remembered the way Mason immediately stopped working whenever his daughter entered the room. For years, Richard had assumed success created good fathers. Now he was beginning to wonder whether good fathers represented a different kind of success altogether. Later that evening, Mason and Olivia sat together on the front porch of their Connecticut home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Olivia rested her head against her father's shoulder. "Do you think Mr. Sterling likes you yet?" she asked. Mason laughed quietly. "I do not know." Olivia thought for a moment. "I think he is trying." Mason looked toward the horizon and smiled. Sometimes children notice truths that adults complicated. And several hundred miles away, Richard Sterling sat alone in a silent office, staring at the city below and realizing that the man he once considered unworthy of his daughter might possess something money had never been able to buy. Autumn arrived quietly, bringing cooler mornings and golden leaves that drifted across sidewalks from Connecticut to Manhattan. Life seemed settled. Mason Brooks continued running his woodworking shop. Charlotte balanced her demanding schedule while finding every opportunity to spend time with Mason and Olivia. Even Richard Sterling appeared calmer than he had been in years. Then everything changed in a single phone call. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Richard was attending a board meeting when his assistant entered the room carrying a message. The expression on her face immediately caught his attention. "Sir, it is your sister." Richard excused himself and stepped into a private office. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When he returned, several executives noticed the color had disappeared from his face. A serious problem had emerged involving a charitable foundation established decades earlier by Charlotte's late mother. Due to a combination of administrative mistakes and legal complications, the foundation suddenly faced the possibility of shutting down. Thousands of scholarships, community programs, and family assistance projects depended upon it. The situation spread through legal teams and consultants almost immediately. Advisors presented reports. Attorneys offered strategies. Public relations experts discussed messaging. Yet every proposed solution focused on protecting reputations rather than helping people. Richard listened for 2 exhausting days. The more meetings he attended, the more frustrated he became. One evening, Charlotte arrived at her father's office. "You look tired," she said. Richard stared at documents covering his desk. "Everyone keeps talking about numbers." Charlotte sat across from him. "Because that is what they understand." Richard sighed. "Your mother created that foundation to help families." For several moments, neither spoke. Then Charlotte asked a simple question. "Have you talked to Mason?" Richard looked up. "Why would I?" Charlotte smiled gently. "Because when people have real problems, he tends to think differently." The following afternoon, Richard drove to Connecticut. He found Mason unloading lumber from a delivery truck behind the workshop. "Mr. Sterling," Mason said. "This is unexpected." Richard nodded. "I need advice." Mason looked genuinely surprised. "From me?" Richard almost laughed. A few months earlier, the idea would have seemed impossible. "Yes, from you." They sat together inside the workshop office while sunlight filtered through the windows. Richard explained the crisis. He described the lawyers, consultants, and endless meetings. Mason listened carefully without interrupting. When Richard finally finished, silence settled across the room. "What do you think?" Richard asked. Mason considered the question. "May I ask something first?" Richard nodded. "Who is the foundation supposed to help?" "Families, students, communities." Mason leaned forward slightly. "Then why is everyone talking about protecting the organization instead of protecting the people?" Richard stared at him. The simplicity of the question landed harder than every expensive report he had reviewed. Mason continued. "If the mission matters, start there." The workshop became quiet again. Outside, Olivia laughed while playing with a neighbor's dog near the parking lot. Richard glanced toward the window. For the second time in his life, Mason Brooks had offered clarity where wealth, influence, and expertise had failed to provide it. And as Richard watched the father and daughter living their ordinary lives, he realized that the man he once doubted had become the person he trusted most. The conversation in the workshop changed the direction of everything that followed. Instead of focusing on legal strategies and public image, Richard Sterling instructed his team to begin with the people the foundation served. The decision surprised executives, attorneys, and consultants. For years, Every major challenge had been approached through numbers first. This time was different. Within days, Richard personally visited several scholarship recipients, community centers, and family programs supported by the foundation. Charlotte joined him whenever her schedule allowed. Together, they listened to stories that had never appeared in financial reports. A young nursing student described how a scholarship had allowed her to remain in school. A single mother explained how emergency assistance had helped her avoid losing her apartment during a difficult period. Community leaders spoke about programs that gave children safe places to learn and grow. Richard listened carefully. The foundation was no longer an organization on paper. It was thousands of lives connected by hope. One Saturday morning, Richard invited Mason and Olivia to attend a community gathering organized to discuss the future of several local programs. The event took place in a modest recreation center rather than a luxury conference hall. Folding chairs replaced executive seating. Homemade refreshments replaced catered meals. Mason arrived wearing a simple work shirt. Olivia walked beside him carrying a tray of cookies she had helped bake that morning. Throughout the event, Richard observed quietly. Residents approached Mason again and again. Some thanked him for helping repair playground equipment. Others mentioned workshops he had organized for teenagers interested in learning practical skills. One elderly man spoke about a wheelchair ramp Mason had built after a storm damaged the original structure. Each conversation revealed another act of service that Mason had never mentioned. Charlotte noticed her father's expression. "You did not know about any of this, did you?" she asked softly. Richard shook his head. "No," Charlotte smiled. "That is because he never does things to be noticed." Later that afternoon, a discussion began about how to preserve several community programs despite the foundation's difficulties. Experts offered complicated proposals. Budgets were examined. Timelines were debated. Then a local volunteer stood and shared an idea inspired by partnerships already working successfully in nearby towns. The room immediately became more optimistic. Richard watched as people collaborated instead of competing. He glanced toward Mason. The single father sat quietly near the back, listening rather than speaking. Yet many of the ideas being discussed had grown from relationships he had built over years of service. Not because he held authority, not because he possessed wealth, because people trusted him. As the gathering ended, children ran across the recreation center while families lingered to talk. Warm afternoon sunlight poured through the windows. Richard stood beside Charlotte and looked across the room. "I spent years believing influence came from power," he admitted. Charlotte followed his gaze toward Mason and Olivia. "And now?" Richard smiled faintly. "Now I think influence comes from earning respect one person at a time." Across the room, Olivia laughed at something her father said. The sound carried through the building with effortless joy. Richard listened for a moment. Then he realized that the greatest lesson of all had never come from boardrooms, business schools, or billion-dollar deals. It had come from watching a single father live the values that everyone else only talked about. Winter arrived just before the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, an event that traditionally gathered business leaders, philanthropists, public officials, and influential families from across the country. The grand ballroom overlooking Manhattan sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers and golden lights. Conversations filled the room as guests discussed investments, charitable initiatives, and social headlines. Yet many people were curious about something far more personal. They wanted to know whether Richard Sterling had truly accepted the man who had entered his daughter's life so unexpectedly months earlier. Near the entrance, Charlotte stood beside Mason Brooks. Olivia remained close to them, dressed elegantly, but still carrying the bright smile that made every room feel warmer. Mason looked exactly as he always did. Calm, respectful, comfortable in his own skin. He had never learned how to perform for wealthy audiences, and by now he no longer cared to try. Across the ballroom, Richard prepared to deliver the evening's keynote address. As he reviewed his notes, he realized they no longer reflected what he truly wanted to say. He folded the prepared speech and placed it aside. Some truths deserve their own words. A few minutes later, the room gradually quieted as Richard approached the stage. Hundreds of guests turned their attention toward him. Cameras focused. Conversation stopped. Richard looked across the crowd before beginning. "For many years," he said, "I believed success could be measured through titles, accomplishments, and financial results." The audience listened attentively. "I spent my life building companies, creating opportunities, and pursuing excellence. Those things matter. They always will. He paused briefly. But recently, I learned that there are qualities even more valuable. The ballroom became completely still. Richard's eyes moved through the crowd until they found Mason. Several months ago, my daughter introduced me to someone I did not expect. A few guests exchanged knowing smiles. Richard continued. To be honest, I thought she would choose someone with a title that impressed the world. Soft laughter moved through the room. Instead, she chose a man whose greatest achievement cannot be found in business magazines or financial reports. Charlotte looked toward her father. Olivia squeezed Mason's hand. Richard stepped away from the podium. I have watched this man serve his community without seeking recognition. I have watched him raise a remarkable daughter with patience, integrity, and love. I have watched him treat every person with the same respect regardless of wealth or status. His voice softened. Most importantly, I have watched him teach me lessons I should have learned long ago. Silence settled over the ballroom. Genuine silence. The kind that appears when people recognize truth. Richard looked directly at Mason. I once thought my daughter deserved a chief executive officer or a prince. A few guests smiled. Then Richard shook his head. I was wrong. The room remained perfectly still. What she found was something far rarer. A good man. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then applause began. Not polite applause. Not social applause. Real applause. People stood, one row after another. Soon the entire ballroom was on its feet. Mason looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. Charlotte smiled through tears of pride. Olivia beamed as though she had known this outcome from the beginning. Richard stepped down from the stage and crossed the room. When he reached Mason, he extended his hand. Mason accepted it. Then Richard did something nobody expected. He pulled him into a brief embrace. The applause grew even louder. Yet the most important moment had already happened. A father had finally learned that character outweighs status, dignity outlasts wealth, and the value of a man is measured not by what he owns, but by the lives he quietly makes better. And in that room full of powerful people, everyone finally understood why Charlotte had made her choice.